Can SlowJoe really pardon his demonic offspring for absolutely every known and unknown criminal depravity over an 11-year period? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on what the Supreme Court says, if it ever gets that far. The Constitution itself is kind of fuzzy on the subject, but previous Supreme Courts have weighed in on the subject in a bad way. Let's dive in. So some of you may recall that in 2001, the commander-in-sperm, Bill Clinton, pardoned his similarly seedy little brother, Roger Clinton, for his 1985 drug trafficking conviction. Billy Boy performed this piece of skullduggery in the last minutes of his lecherous regime on the morning of January 20th. So, nepo pardoning of a family member does have precedent. Nasty precedent. But what about pardoning someone for crimes that haven't even been processed or prosecuted yet? Well, it's been done dozens of times in U.S. history. The most famous is Goofy Jerry Ford's 1974 pardoning of Richard Nixon, on the tragedy of Watergate, even though Tricky Dicky hadn't been charged yet after resigning the presidency. So you can pardon a family member, and you can allegedly pardon someone for crimes unknown or unprosecuted. Or can you? Let's take a quick look at U.S. history, the U.S. Constitution, and key Supreme Court rulings going back almost 160 years. And actually, there's one specific ruling we're going to talk about. If you're naive about the presidential pardoning thing, like me, you may think that there's only been 100 or 200 of them, right? No. The 45 presidents of the United States of America have issued more than 200,000 blanket pardons to conscientious objectors of the Vietnam War and former Confederate officials after the Civil War, and more than 20,000 individual pardons. Franklin Roosevelt was the biggest pardoner with more than 3,000. It's mind-boggling, and most of those pardoned were not even innocent. Donald Trump issued the second least amount of pardons, 237, behind the first Bush, 77. In the last 120 years, Democrat presidents issued more than 3 times as many pardons as Republicans. The first to issue a pardon, by the way, was George Washington himself in 1795 to 2 men involved in the Whiskey Rebellion. You remember that, right? Okay, so pardons have come fast and furious, and their power comes from the Constitution. So here's exactly what Article 2, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution says about presidential pardons. The president shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States. That's it. Pretty simple. It would seem from this wording that the founders of America intended for the pardon power to be only federal, for offenses against the United States, in other words. Criminal acts involving federal law, right? According to legal scholars, this was the intent, and all acts committed in the states were to be adjudicated and potentially pardoned by state governors. But a Supreme Court decision in 1866 changed all that, giving the president complete pardoning power concerning all law-breaking throughout the United States and the power to pardon someone even before they were charged with a crime. The 1866 case was Ex parte Garland, involving the pardon by President Andrew Johnson of a former Confederate soldier. Here's what the Supreme Court concluded at the time on its sweeping decision on pardoning powers. Pardoning power extends to every offense known to the law and may be exercised at any time after its commission, either before legal proceedings are taken or during their pendency or after conviction and judgment. So yes, this decision 158 years ago does indeed give SlowJoe Biden the authority to pardon scum son Hunter Biden for any and everything that Joey wishes to pardon him for, whether he's been charged or not, and for the time period stated in the pardon. And since the Constitution says nothing about familial ties, Joey was also free to pardon a family member. In fact, Biden may be free to pardon himself. Scholars can't agree on this matter. Richard Nixon considered doing it until those around him convinced him that history would not have kind things to say about him if he did. Okay, so you remember what I said at the beginning about this whole Biden pardoning thing on Hunter Biden is going to concern the current U.S. Supreme Court, specifically on the pardoning of offenses that haven't occurred or charges aren't known. Theoretically, the conservative Supreme Court could decide to overthrow the absurd 1866 decision before legal proceedings and determine that only those actually convicted of a crime could be pardoned by the president. Otherwise, you get the absurd reality of a sitting president pardoning everybody in his administration and in the deep state for everything, everywhere, all at once, and forever. Some ludicrous blanket immunity for any and everything and everyone. And he could do it in the very last minutes of his presidency on the morning of January 20th, in the so-called Midnight Massacre of pardons and pardoning. That's, what it's called. That's how they usually do it. SlowJoe is thinking of doing something like that right now with Fatality Fauci and many other nefarious and evil power brokers who caused the deaths of thousands of Americans and or instigated the imprisonment of innocent people such as the January 6th sham. My personal preference is that we pass a constitutional amendment that doesn't allow a president to interfere with the judicial process or intervene in the judicial process and keep that fourth wall of separation that the founders wanted in the U.S. government. Or even better, starting all over with a new constitution that fully protects our individual rights and limits the power brokers to only protecting our rights. That seems to me a great place to start again with our wonderful and great country.